October 14th, 8:37, a kitchen lit by a single hanging bulb, rain touching the windows in patient, irregular taps. The conversation had already ended, but it was still echoing. Across the table, someone you once would have reassured sits back in their chair, confused. Their fork rests against porcelain, the air feels thicker than it should, you haven't raised your voice, you haven't withdrawn physically, you're still here. But something is different. I don't know, they say slowly, you've just been distant. The word lands softly, distant. You don't defend yourself, you don't rush to repair the atmosphere, you don't fill the silence like you used to, you let it stand. And in that stillness, something irreversible has already happened. You didn't become cold. You became precise. It's hard to mark the exact day it began. There was no dramatic betrayal, no singular explosion, no grand rupture, just small moments accumulating like sediment in a riverbed. Times you overexplained your intentions. Times you absorbed someone else's frustration to keep peace. Times you laughed gently when something actually hurt. You were generous with your emotional labor, generous with access, generous with your warmth. And generosity, when unconscious, has no boundaries. From a Jungian perspective, what people call becoming colder is often the early phase of individuation, the gradual withdrawal of projections and the reclamation of psychic energy. It does not look heroic. It does not look inspiring. It looks like distance. You stopped volunteering explanations. You stopped rescuing conversations from discomfort. You stopped offering reassurance before anyone even asked. And to those who benefited from your openness, the shift feels like loss. They don't see the recalibration, they only feel the absence of excess. You can almost trace the moment it crystallized. It wasn't anger, it wasn't resentment, it was exhaustion, but not the dramatic kind, a quieter fatigue, the kind that comes from constantly anticipating other people's emotional weather. You realized you were adjusting your tone before you even knew your true reaction, softening your edges in advance, pre-editing yourself. And then one day you didn't. Not out of rebellion, out of alignment. The change was subtle, but it was surgical. Where you once responded instantly, you began to pause. Where you once offered access, you began to observe. Where you once absorbed tension, you let it sit in the room. Silence at first felt dangerous. You had built a reputation on warmth, on emotional availability, on being easy to talk to. And now you were becoming harder to reach. Not because you were closed. Because you were discerning. Carl Jung believed the persona, the version of us that adapts to social expectation, can become overdeveloped, swallowing the deeper self. When that persona begins to thin, the environment reacts. It experiences your adjustment as withdrawal. But what if it isn't withdrawal? What if it's refinement? Look closely at that kitchen table again. The rain hasn't changed, the room hasn't changed, the other person hasn't changed. Only your tolerance for emotional overextension has. There's a stillness in your posture now, a kind of contained warmth. It doesn't spill automatically, it doesn't rush toward discomfort to neutralize it. It waits. And waiting unnerves people who relied on your immediacy. You seem different lately, they say again. Different. The word carries accusation and uncertainty at once. You feel the old impulse rise, the instinct to clarify, to reassure, to smooth over, to say, no, I'm just tired, or I'm fine, or I didn't mean it like that. But you don't. Because you didn't mean it like that. You meant it exactly as it came out. That is the precision. Emotional generosity used to mean availability without calculation. You believed warmth proved goodness, that openness equaled integrity. But something matured. You began to notice who reciprocated depth and who merely consumed it, who respected silence and who tried to puncture it, who leaned in gently and who leaned in expecting you to carry the weight. And without ceremony, your heart recalibrated. This recalibration doesn't announce itself. There is no speech, no boundary-setting monologue, no grand declaration of I've changed. There is only a quiet internal shift. Not everyone gets access. Not every moment requires explanation. Not every discomfort must be softened. To those watching from the outside, it feels like cooling. To you, it feels like clarity. You haven't withdrawn warmth. You've concentrated it. and concentration always appears smaller than diffusion. That's the paradox. The people who were closest to your overflow feel your containment most intensely. They interpret your restraint as rejection. They sense the new edges and don't know how to navigate them. But something inside you refuses to revert. Because for the first time, your energy returns to you at the end of the day. For the first time, you are not exhausted by conversations that once felt harmless. For the first time, you are not scanning rooms for emotional instability to manage. You sit back in that kitchen chair. The rain continues, the bulb hums faintly overhead. Across the table, they wait for you to say something that will restore the old rhythm. You don't. And in that silence, the real question begins to form. If you are no longer endlessly available, who are you now? The room does not collapse. That's the first surprise. You expected tension to escalate, you expected discomfort to sharpen into conflict. For years, you believed that if you didn't actively maintain emotional equilibrium, everything would fracture. But nothing fractures. The rain continues its steady percussion against the glass. A car passes outside, tires hissing across wet asphalt. The world does not punish you for restraint. Across the table, they shift in their seat. You can almost see the recalculation happening behind their eyes. This is new terrain. For a long time, you were predictable, not in personality but in response. You absorbed tension like insulation. You filled silence before it could become awkward. You offered understanding before it was earned. It made you valuable. It also made you porous. From a Jungian perspective, individuation begins when psychic energy, once projected outward, starts returning inward. That return feels destabilizing at first, not to you but to those accustomed to your emotional surplus. You were once the emotional first responder. A slight shift in tone from someone else, and you were already adjusting. A hint of disappointment, and you were clarifying your intentions. A pause in conversation, and you were rushing to fill it. Not because you were weak. Because you were attuned. But attunement without boundaries becomes self-erasure. The recalibration didn't happen in a single night, it happened in small refusals. You didn't immediately text back. You didn't over-explain a minor decision. You didn't apologize for needing space. Each time, a faint discomfort surfaced, like stepping onto ice you weren't sure would hold. But it held. And something unexpected followed, relief. You began to notice how much energy you had been spending preemptively, anticipating misunderstandings that hadn't occurred, managing emotions that weren't yours, cushioning reactions that might never come. It was a constant outward orientation. Precision is different. Precision asks, is this mine to carry? Is this mine to fix? Is this even mine to absorb? The answers increasingly were no. This is where people misread you. They sense the shift from instinctive accommodation to measured response. They feel the pause before you answer. They notice the absence of automatic reassurance. And they interpret that pause as withdrawal. But it isn't withdrawal. It's filtration. You are no longer offering your interior to everyone who knocks. There's a scene you remember. Late evening, your phone lights up with a familiar name. Someone who often calls not to share but to unload. You already know the rhythm, their frustration, your listening, your steady stream of validation. Your thumb hovers over the screen. In the past, you would have answered immediately, regardless of your own fatigue. Tonight, you let it ring. The silence that follows feels almost transgressive. You sit with it. Your heart beats a little faster, not from guilt, from unfamiliar autonomy. You realize something profound. Warmth does not require constant access. Carl Jung believed that integration involves differentiating the self from the collective demands around it. The more whole a person becomes, the less compelled they are to react reflexively. Reaction drains. Response preserves. You are learning the difference. And preservation changes your presence. You speak more slowly now, not to appear composed, but because you are no longer rushing to stabilize every emotional fluctuation in the room. You allow people to sit with their own discomfort. You allow silence to stretch. You allow misunderstandings to exist without immediately correcting them. Not out of indifference, out of respect for yourself and strangely for them. Because when you stop cushioning every impact, others are forced to develop their own balance. This is the part no one talks about. When you were endlessly available, you trained people to rely on your regulation, your consistency, your emotional surplus. Now that surplus is contained. And containment feels like absence to those who never realized how much you were compensating. There is grief in this phase. Not loud grief, not dramatic. A subtle ache when someone says, "You used to be easier to talk to." Easier. You examine that word privately. Easier often meant you bent first. Easier often meant you absorbed more. Easier often meant you translated your complexity into something digestible. Precision is not easy. It requires letting others meet you where you actually are, not where you once lowered yourself to be understood. In quiet moments, you begin to feel something new. Not detachment. Density. Your presence has weight now. When you speak, it carries intention. When you listen, it is chosen, not reflexive. When you give warmth, it is directed, not diffused. And that direction makes it more powerful, but also more selective. The people who valued your depth will notice something different in this phase. They won't accuse you of coldness. They'll sense clarity. They'll feel that when you offer attention, it is deliberate. When you share vulnerability, it is meaningful. When you remain silent, it is intentional. Others, however, will grow uneasy. Because precision removes ambiguity. It makes visible who engaged with you reciprocally and who merely leaned on your availability. You begin to see patterns you once ignored. Conversations that revolve around them. Moments when your needs subtly shifted the atmosphere. Subtle dismissals you previously translated into generosity. Now you don't translate. You observe. An observation changes everything. The kitchen scene from before, it was not about that single moment. It was the first time someone felt your containment. But it won't be the last. As your energy consolidates, your world reorganizes. Some connections deepen because they were built on mutual presence. Others loosen because they were built on your emotional overflow. And in the quiet space left behind, a question begins to surface, one that feels both liberating and unsettling. If you are no longer defined by how much you give, what defines you now? It happens gradually. Not with confrontation, but with tone. A pause that lingers a second too long. A message that feels slightly formal. An invitation that stops coming as often. No one announces their confusion directly anymore. They adjust around you instead. You notice it in small ways. You share a thought measured, unembellished, and someone responds with careful neutrality, as if unsure how to approach you now. You used to be predictable warmth, immediate reassurance, open access. Now you are composed, contained, selective. And people don't quite know where to place you. From a Jungian perspective, when the persona begins to thin, the projections others placed onto you lose their anchor. They feel disoriented, not because you've changed maliciously, but because you no longer reflect back the version of them that depended on your endless accommodation. They miss the mirror. You can feel the shift most clearly in group settings. There was a time when you instinctively kept conversations flowing. You would notice who felt excluded and subtly draw them in. You would sense tension and redirect it. You were the invisible stabilizer. Now you observe more than you intervene. You sit back, you listen, you allow awkwardness to breathe. At first, the silence feels almost unbearable, like watching something you could easily fix. But you don't. And something strange happens. The room recalibrates without you. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but independently. This is the part that unsettles you. If they can adjust without your constant mediation, who were you before? Were you indispensable or simply overfunctioning? The question lands heavier than expected. There is a grief in realizing how much of your identity was built on being needed. Not loved for your essence, but relied upon for your regulation. When you withdraw that unconscious service, dynamics shift. Some people step forward. Some step back. Some quietly disappear. The ones who disappear hurt the most. Not because they leave dramatically, but because their absence confirms something you were beginning to suspect. They were connected to your output, not your interior. You replay conversations in your mind. Moments when you expressed fatigue and the subject quickly pivoted back to them. Times when you hinted at needing space and were met with subtle disappointment. You used to interpret those reactions as your failure to communicate well enough. Now you see them differently. Carl Jung believed that individuation often isolates a person temporarily because the path inward is not crowded. When you stop conforming to unconscious roles, you disrupt the emotional contracts others never knew they had with you. And contracts, once broken, reveal their terms. You begin to notice how often you were expected to smooth tension, clarify ambiguity, soothe insecurity. Without announcing it, you decline those roles. The first few times, guilt flickers. Are you becoming detached? Are you losing empathy? But when you sit quietly with yourself, the answer is clear. Your empathy remains intact, it is simply no longer automatic. There is a difference between compassion and compulsion. Compulsion reacts to avoid discomfort. Compassion responds with intention. You are choosing the latter. Still, the discomfort of being misunderstood lingers. Someone says half-jokingly, "You've become hard to read." You almost smile. Hard to read. As if you were once a public document, margins open, thoughts footnoted, emotions annotated for easy access. Now you are a closed book until invited properly. Precision requires privacy. Not secrecy, privacy. The distinction matters. You are not hiding, you are containing. And containment shifts how others approach you. Some begin to test your edges. They push slightly, waiting for the old reflex to return, a subtle guilt trip, a familiar emotional hook. You feel it. The old version of you would have responded immediately, proving your care, reaffirming your availability. Now you pause. The hook falls. And in that pause, something reorders internally. For the first time, you experience your own boundary not as defense, but as alignment. There is strength in not reacting. But there is also loneliness. Because precision reduces noise, and noise once filled space. The absence of constant engagement leaves silence. Longer evenings, fewer impulsive calls, conversations that end without overextension. At first, you wonder if you have miscalculated. Is maturity supposed to feel this quiet? Then you begin to notice something else. Your thoughts are clearer. Your emotional state is steadier. You are no longer carrying fragments of other people's unresolved tensions into your own interior. There is space inside you now. Space where anxiety once lingered, space where overanalysis once spiraled. You sit alone one evening, no television, no phone, no background noise. Just the hum of the room. And for the first time in years, your silence does not feel like absence. It feels like ownership. Ownership of your reactions. Ownership of your energy. Ownership of your identity beyond usefulness. You realize something subtle but profound. You were never cold. You were overexposed. Precision is simply the act of closing unnecessary doors. But there is still one question waiting beneath it all. If your warmth is no longer automatic, who truly earns it? And are you ready to see the answer? The first time you withhold warmth intentionally, it feels almost unnatural. Not cruel, not harsh. Just deliberate. Someone across from you shares a story, not a vulnerable one, but a familiar one, the kind that once would have triggered your immediate reassurance, a subtle fishing for validation, a quiet expectation that you will fill the emotional gap. You listen. You nod. But you do not overextend. No extra affirmations, no emotional padding, no reflexive soothing. The silence stretches, and this time you do not rush to rescue it. You can feel their surprise. It isn't that you've become distant, it's that your warmth now arrives with calibration. It has weight, it lands intentionally, not automatically. From a Jungian perspective, individuation is not the loss of connection, it is the refinement of it. The psyche begins to discriminate between what nourishes and what depletes, between what aligns and what entangles. You are no longer entangled. And that changes the texture of your presence. There was a time when your kindness was constant like ambient light. It filled every space without being asked. Now it is directional like a spotlight. And people feel the difference. The ones who come to you with sincerity, who meet you with grounded presence, still receive warmth, perhaps even more than before, because now it is concentrated, undiluted, real. But the ones who relied on your emotional excess feel the absence sharply. You've changed, someone says quietly. This time it doesn't sound accusatory, it sounds uncertain. You consider the word again. Changed. You realize something subtle. They are not reacting to who you've become. They are reacting to who you are no longer willing to be. The old version of you anticipated needs before they were spoken. You could sense discomfort in micro-expressions. You could feel tension before it surfaced. But anticipation became assumption, and assumption became exhaustion. You were living half a second ahead of everyone else's emotions. Now you live in real time. If someone is uncomfortable, you let them articulate it. If someone is disappointed, you let them name it. If someone is confused, you allow them to ask. You are no longer translating silence into responsibility. And that shift, though quiet, is seismic. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity involves withdrawing projections, not only those we place onto others but those others place onto us. When you stop performing unconscious roles, the projections collapse. And when they collapse, people must confront themselves without your mediation. That is not always welcomed. You begin to see how often your warmth once acted as anesthesia. It softened sharp truths, it absorbed friction, it delayed necessary confrontations. Without it, conversations become clearer. Not louder. Clearer. Someone expresses frustration, and you don't rush to apologize. You ask a simple question instead: what exactly bothered you? The question is steady, uncharged. And suddenly the dynamic shifts. You are no longer absorbing the blame preemptively. You are inviting accountability. Precision has this effect. It exposes what was once diffused. In private moments, you reflect on how strange this transformation feels. You still care deeply. You still feel empathy instantly. But empathy no longer dictates action. You are not compelled to fix what you understand. That restraint is new and powerful. There is a particular evening that stays with you. You're sitting across from someone who once leaned heavily on your reassurance. They share something vulnerable, but this time it is different. There is ownership in their voice. They are not asking you to stabilize them. They are sharing. You feel warmth rise naturally. This time you offer it fully, not out of obligation but resonance. And it feels deeper than anything you offered before. Because now it is chosen. Selective warmth has gravity. It teaches others how to approach you. It teaches them that access is not assumed, it is cultivated. And in that cultivation, something unexpected happens. Your relationships become fewer, but truer. The noise fades. The frantic energy of overextension dissolves. What remains is slower, quieter, denser. You realize that becoming precise was never about building walls. It was about building structure. Structure allows warmth to hold its shape. Without it, generosity spills everywhere, including into places that never intended to reciprocate. You look back at who you were before. Not with regret. With compassion. You were learning through overflow. Now you are learning through containment. And in that containment, your identity sharpens. You are no longer the person who can be reached at any emotional frequency. You are the person who responds when resonance is real. But there is one final shift still unfolding. Because once you become precise with others, you must become precise with yourself. It doesn't happen in a dramatic moment. There's no applause, no confrontation, no visible marker that says this is who you are now. It happens on an ordinary afternoon. 3:12 p.m. light falling through a window onto the floor, dust suspended in still air, the world moving at its usual pace. You are alone. No one asking anything of you, no one lining, no one waiting for you to stabilize the room. And you notice something unfamiliar. You feel steady. Not needed. Not validated. Not praised. Steady. This is the part no one warned you about. When you stop defining yourself by how much you give, there is a temporary void. The old identity, the one built on emotional availability, dissolves, and for a while you stand in open space. Who are you when you are not responding? Who are you when you are not rescuing? Who are you when silence doesn't require you? From a Jungian perspective, individuation is not about becoming less relational, it is about becoming internally sourced. The center of gravity shifts from outer approval to inner alignment. And that shift is quiet. You begin noticing how differently you move through conversations now. You listen fully, but you do not over-identify. You care, but you do not overcommit. You speak, but you do not over-explain. There is a subtle authority in your tone, not dominance, not distance. Authority. The authority of someone who no longer negotiates their existence. You remember how often you once softened your clarity to avoid discomfort. You remember shrinking a strong opinion into something more digestible. You remember translating your complexity into simplicity for the sake of harmony. Now harmony is not built on self-erasure. It is built on alignment. You are not louder. You are cleaner. And people respond differently. Some lean in closer, sensing the depth behind your stillness. Some keep their distance, unsure how to access you now. And you let both reactions exist. There is no longer urgency to be universally understood. That is the most radical shift of all. Carl Jung believed that the more a person integrates their shadow, the rejected, overextended, over-accommodating parts, the less they seek approval through performance. They become less reactive to misunderstanding. You feel that now. When someone misreads your pause as coldness, it no longer shakes you. You don't scramble to correct the narrative, you don't rush to prove warmth. You simply remain. Because you know something they don't yet see. Your warmth has not diminished. It has distilled. Distillation removes excess. What remains is potent. You feel it in small moments. When you choose to reach out, it is intentional. When you offer comfort, it is wholehearted. When you commit, it is grounded. There is no leakage. No half-giving. No emotional aftertaste of resentment. Precision has given your generosity backbone. And backbone changes everything. You walk into a room now without scanning for instability. You don't measure every facial expression for potential tension. You don't anticipate emotional shifts before they happen. You let the room be. And because you let it be, you remain intact. This integrity creates something unexpected: respect. Not the loud kind, not applause. A quiet respect. People begin to approach you more thoughtfully. They sense that your attention is valuable, that your time is deliberate, that your emotional presence is not ambient, it is chosen. And chosen things carry weight. There's a final realization that settles in slowly. You were never meant to be endlessly open. You were meant to be intentional. Emotional generosity is beautiful, but without discernment, it dissolves identity. With discernment, it becomes strength. You think back to that kitchen table, the rain, the accusation hidden inside the word distant. If you could return to that moment now, you wouldn't defend yourself. You would simply understand. They mistook overflow for warmth. They mistook availability for care. They mistook accommodation for love. But love in its mature form has edges. It does not abandon itself to prove its depth. You didn't become cold. You stopped abandoning yourself. And in that return, in that reclamation of energy, clarity, and selective presence, something profound emerged. Not hardness. Not distance. Not isolation. Identity. An identity no longer shaped by who needs you most, but by who you choose to be when no one is watching. The rain has stopped now. The room is quiet. And for the first time, your silence feels like power.